Okay, here we go again. The title of this talk is Dissident Physics, Beckmann's Theory. So I'm picking up from my previous talk, New Dissidents of Physics, where dissidents in the 1990s opposed to Einstein were able to meet in the mainstream at a conference. Relevant article dealing with this is this one in the Scientist magazine, and they met at the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference. And this is a picture of them at that meeting, and I'll point out again that they spelt Newtonians wrong, and the dissidents were supposed to be the neo-Newtonians who were wanting to bring back Newtonian physics. Einstein supposedly revolutionized physics away from Newtonian physics, but they want to bring back Newtonian physics. The article was by Billy Goodman. It points out there was only one physicist in the group opposing Einstein. He says critics of conventional physics include consultants, engineers, mathematicians, historians of science, and an encyclopedia salesman, but few physicists. They claim they cannot publish their ideas in mainstream journals, and that the bias against them is so extreme that in essence one cannot become a physicist if one criticises the special theory of relativity. Indeed, the one exception to the rule, a physics professor at the University of Connecticut, did not reveal his skepticism of Einstein's theory until after he had tenure. That physicist seems to have been Hayden, because Billy Goodman goes on to say Howard Hayden, also at Connecticut, may be the only tenured physicist among the dissidents. This is the blog of Howard Hayden. He has several controversial views on things, not just on relativity. Unfortunately, Howard Hayden seems to have stabbed the other dissidents that he was supposed to be supporting in the back. As Billy Goodman goes on to report, Hayden attended the San Francisco meeting but found it not very useful. I was happy to make the acquaintance of two or three people, this is what Hayden says, but the majority of talks were off the wall. Presumably off the wall means bad, because that expression often means crazy. Goodman goes on to say Hayden, who like most of the dissidents feels that special relativity has not been properly tested, nevertheless dismisses many of his fellow dissenters as just rebels against authority. So Hayden, the dissident physicist who thinks special relativity has not been properly tested, is not going along with the other dissidents. So the one dissident physicist is thus much more restrained in his criticism of Einstein's relativity. So it'd be interesting to know what this lone physicist Hayden among the dissidents believed, and that takes us to Beckmann's theory via Tom Bethel. This is Tom Bethel, as pointed out by Wikipedia. He was an American journalist who wrote mainly on economic and scientific issues, and he had several controversial views on things. So Tom says, a major turning point in the public's understanding of science came about a century ago with the introduction of Einstein's special and general theories of relativity. Before then, educated laymen were expected to and usually could understand new developments in science, such as physics, at least in outline. After Einstein, this changed. Science moved beyond the ken of educated laymen. You didn't understand what these new arguments were about. Then stick to your poetry or perhaps your knitting. Science was becoming a private party to which you were invited, except that increasingly your taxis were expected to pay for it. So basically, with Einstein, physics is supposed to be becoming too complicated for just the ordinary person to understand it anymore. If you were educated layman, you could at least grasp the basics of Newtonian physics, but with Einstein's relativity, it was supposed to be too complicated, and you were supposed to be excluded from having a say on the subject. It became sort of an elitism. Bethel says Newton's laws of motion and gravity always were intelligible to the layman and could be expressed in plain language. Einstein's relativity changed that in the direction of reduced intelligibility, that is, and vastly increased complexity. I shall go further and say that relativity failed to improve on Newtonian physics in terms of accuracy, in terms of, I would say, not so easy to understand. And many in the Dissident community wants physics returned to the intelligibility of Newtonian physics, as noted earlier, the neo-Newtonians, neo meaning new. Bethel says, recently I wrote a book about relativity, questioning Einstein is the title of the book. Is relativity necessary? It was based on the research and arguments of Peter Beckmann, who taught electrical engineering at the University of Colorado after defecting from Czechoslovakia in 1963. And Beckmann wrote several books. He argued that the facts that led to relativity could more easily be explained by classical physics being Newtonian physics, without Einstein's relativity. His book was in many ways technical, but before he died in 1993, he reviewed it for my benefit in a series of tape-recorded interviews. I was also familiar with his newsletter, Access to Energy, an excellent popularizer of science. Beckmann could have written a popular anti-relativity book himself and had considered doing so, but he believed that it would be ignored. A technical one just might be accepted. He thought he was wrong about that. His book was neither attacked nor even reviewed. It sold quite well, however, because he advertised it. I told him that I would write a popular account myself. I still have my tapes in which he talks not just about relativity, but about his high school education in England and so forth. Next we get to the link to Howard Hayden. Bethel says he, which is Beckmann, died long before I could write my book, but by then Howard Hayden, with the physics department at the University of Connecticut, had accepted Beckmann's arguments. Today Hayden is retired and the publisher of a newsletter, The Energy Advocate. The help he gave me in writing my book was indispensable. So that's a link to Howard Hayden, who was at the Dissidents group at their conference in the 1990s. As per Wikipedia, this is Peter Beckmann. He was a professor of electrical engineering and so forth. Later in his life he disputed Einstein's theory of relativity and other accepted theories in modern physics. We could now look at what Hayden thought about Beckmann's theory, but let's stay with Tony Bethel for the human issues side of things. So Tom says, in the course of writing the book, I found that many physicists are uncomfortable discussing relativity theory. They believe it is true, but they doubt their ability to explain it. Few can respond to questions if they have not actually taught relativity at the university level, and that is a tiny subset of all physicists. Special relativity, which is 1905, has a special difficulty. It baffles almost everyone, yet nothing more than high school algebra is involved. So it's not the maths which is causing the problem, it's what we must accept, something that is impossible to believe, except on Einstein's authority. If Peter Beckmann is right, we should reject that authority, as indeed we should reject authority in all fields of science. So Tom then goes on, I'll try to explain that difficulty, but first let me make a simple clarification. What about E equals mc squared? You might ask, surely that must be true, and was it not based on relativity? It is the one thing that laymen know about relativity, and here we come to something that the easy Einstein books and most of the not so easy ones never tell you. Yes, the famous equation was derived from relativity theory, but Einstein himself also derived it years later in the late 1940s without relativity, and that's not something I've looked into, but that is the claim from Tom. But what I do know is that E equals mc squared was derived before Einstein, and it's supposed to be in this Italian person, Di Pietro, mentioned at this website, and you're supposed to have written a paper on it before Einstein. Then there's other people who are also supposed to have dealt with the equations similar to E equals mc squared. And this is a translation of what the Italian wrote in his paper. He goes on to say, what is in comparison to it the energy that can be derived from the richest combustible or from the most powerful chemical reaction? And he was amazed at his E equals mc squared equation. Unfortunately, such claims as this Italian having E equals mc squared before Einstein ends up as arguable, because people who want to support Einstein's genius try to find excuses to dismiss such evidence. Tom goes on, it was the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887 that launched special relativity. It involves only unaccelerated linear motion. If curved motion, acceleration of gravity are involved, then we must turn to general relativity, where the maths gets much more difficult. It was the Michelson-Morley experiment, this is what I'm saying, that supposedly disposed of the ether, and I have dealt with that in other talks, and I say that's a mistake. So skipping over what Tom says about the ether, and ether can be spelled as AETHER or as ETHER. Tom then goes on to say, and that brings us to Beckmann's alternative, i.e. alternative to special relativity. He amends Michelson's worldview in a simple way. Following Clerk Maxwell's lead, Michelson assumed that the ether, the luminescence medium, was made of a fine-grained substance that fills the entirety of space uniformly. The emphasis was on the last word. The ether was thought to be a uniform entity, equal in density everywhere. And Peter Beckmann made a different claim. He argued that the ether is equivalent to the gravitational field, which of course is non-uniform. Picking up on Peter Beckmann making a different claim. I think this ties into what Einstein was saying in 1920 when he seems to be bringing back the ether. And this is the quote from what Einstein was saying in 1920, recapitulating: "We may say that according to general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether." So somehow Einstein's new ether is space-time, and distortions in that are the gravitational field. So Beckmann's ether is tied into what Einstein is talking about with his new ether. And however, I'm not happy with calling it the gravitational field, because really you should tie it into the electromagnetic field as well, and that would be the unified field of electromagnetism, gravity. And Einstein didn't give us quite that theory of unifying those things. Bethel connects Einstein's ether with Beckmann's and says, amazingly, Einstein himself revived Beckmann's idea about the ether in 1916 for DLC, Ludwig Kostro's book. I don't know about the 1916 date. I have Einstein talking about it in 1920. Anyway, according to Bethel, some of Einstein's allies criticised him, which is Einstein, for restoring the ether, having abolished it a decade earlier. So it was downplayed about Einstein bringing back the ether. According to Bethel, Hayden believes that Beckmann's theory gives the same results as Einstein's general relativity, but by a far simpler method. For various reasons, Einstein's special relativity should be discarded. And he goes on to conclude: at present, the world of orthodox physics is unwilling to re-examine Einstein's relativity. Where the special general, it would fall apart if subjected to real scrutiny, I believe. But in science and perhaps everywhere else, the simple should always be preferred to the complex. All else being equal, such revision, if it ever came to pass, would also constitute a serious challenge to the priesthood of physics, of science and of physics. Perhaps that's why the relativists are hanging tough. The relativists don't want to change from saying there's no ether, even though Einstein wanted to bring the ether back. And so we go back to this conference, which was talked about in the Scientist magazine. What the Dissident should have been doing was promoting a theory of what they wanted to replace special relativity by, and rallying behind just one theory, which would probably be something like Beckmann's theory, which ideally Hayden should have been doing it at that conference, of promoting Beckmann's theory, if he had known of Beckmann's theory at that time. But as it is, such distance meetings don't rally behind supporting one theory. Instead, as they did in the 1990s, they still do. They present lots of different theories. And when they do that, they present lots of different theories, the mainstream just wants to ignore that. If they were a group of people and they said, oh, this is the theory you should replace special relativity by, that would be more impressive to the mainstream. But they're not doing that. They're just squabbling among themselves with different theories. So that all acts as enabling the mainstream to just keep sweeping certain things under the carpet. If the dissidents could rally behind one theory and present that to the mainstream, then the mainstream would take that more seriously. But so far, the dissidents have not been able to organise themselves behind that. They're more interested in talking about different theories. Each person can have a different theory to somebody else, and they just talk about that. Thank you, that's the end. Finish.